The attic smelled of dust, old wood, and forgotten years. A single beam of sunlight cut through a grimy window, falling on a small, rusted chest tucked in the corner. It had sat there for decades untouched, as though the shadows themselves had guarded its secrets. Today, that silence would be broken. I lifted the lid with a creak that echoed through the empty space, and inside lay a collection of notebooks, letters, and scraps of paper, some neatly folded, others ragged and torn. The faded handwriting was unmistakable. Ernesto Che Guevara. The world knew him as the fiery revolutionary, the icon on posters and T-shirts, the man who had toppled regimes and chased ideals across continents. But these papers whispered another story, one hidden from history, one written in moments of quiet solitude and private despair. The first diary I opened was leather-bound, worn soft by travel, and hands that had touched it with care. The ink had faded to a warm sepia, but the words were sharp, deliberate, intimate. Here was Che, not the invincible figure of legend, but a man wrestling with doubt, fear, and longing. I lie awake tonight, listening to the wind scraping the trees. The men sleep, trusting me to guide them, to lead them to something greater. And yet, I feel the weight of failure pressing against my chest. Will my ideals survive the cruelty of the world? Or will they crumble, leaving only my mistakes behind? Even the choice of words was telling. I lie awake tonight, not we. A subtle, poignant reminder that the man who inspired thousands often felt profoundly alone. I felt a strange chill as I turned the pages, reading lines that revealed both determination and vulnerability. He wrote of small, human fears that no photograph or public speech could convey. The fear of dying before the work was done, the fear of betraying his own ideals, and most quietly, the fear of being forgotten. One letter, addressed to an unnamed confidant, seemed almost apologetic. I have chosen a path that takes me far from those I love. Each step feels both necessary and cruel. I hope history will understand, though my heart trembles at the thought that it may not. The words stung. Here was the cost of the revolutionary life, not the political battles or the headlines, but the private, aching sacrifice of human connection. As I read, I could almost hear him pacing by candlelight, the scratching of his pen echoing against the walls of a lonely room. There were doodles in the margins, small sketches of mountains, rifles, and faces, half-finished, almost shy. Even in the midst of plotting grand strategies, he allowed these tiny glimpses of imagination, a fleeting tenderness in a world defined by chaos. A shadow passed across the attic window, and I looked up, startled. For a moment, I imagined Che himself standing there, silent, observing. The idea was absurd, and yet the diaries carried his presence so vividly that it was impossible not to feel it. History had given us the man in war, fiery speeches, black beret, cigarette dangling. But these diaries were the man at rest, the man alone, the man human. And then a sentence caught my eye, almost hidden among lines of strategy and philosophical musings. I am afraid that the world will only remember the mask I wear, the revolutionary, the soldier, the hero. But who will remember the nights I lay awake, the tears I swallowed, the doubts I buried beneath the banner of ideals? A shiver ran down my spine. That was the promise of this discovery, not to glorify or vilify, but to reveal the human truth behind the myth. Che had been a symbol, a legend, a target of admiration and fear alike. But beneath all that, he was someone who felt deeply, who wrestled with himself in ways the public would never see. I closed the diary gently, hesitant to break the connection. There was a sacredness to these pages, a sense that the man who had inspired revolutions still whispered across time, asking to be understood, not idolized. And as I looked at the rest of the chest, filled with letters and journals, I realized that this journey had just begun. Each page I turned would pull me deeper into the private world of Che Guevara, revealing the doubts, the fears, and the humanity hidden behind the revolutionary's mask. This was not a story about the battles he fought in jungles or cities. This was a story about the battles within him, the ones no one else would ever see. And in that realization, I felt both awe and a strange, aching sorrow. The legend of Che Guevara was only half the truth. The rest lay in these hidden letters, waiting to speak, waiting to be heard. With trembling hands, I opened the next notebook. The adventure into Che's secret mind had begun, and I knew, with a mix of excitement and trepidation, that nothing would ever feel the same again. The notebooks continued to reveal themselves, one page flowing into the next, like a river of thoughts unfiltered by history. The more I read, the clearer it became that Che Guevara's mind was never at rest. Victory in the mountains, speeches to thousands, clandestine meetings with comrades. These were only the surface. Beneath it, a restless, questioning soul constantly weighed the cost of his choices. One evening in the notebook, Che wrote from a small, dimly lit room somewhere in the Sierra Maestra. I wonder if I am merely a shadow of the men I lead. They trust me to guide them, to make decisions with certainty. Yet I feel nothing but uncertainty tonight. Am I courageous or merely foolish? History demands heroes, but the soul demands truth, and the truth is that I tremble. Reading this, I felt the gravity of his solitude. Even among allies, surrounded by those who shared his cause, he carried a private fear, a gnawing sense of inadequacy. Che was a man expected to inspire, yet he questioned his own ability to do so. Another letter, this one written to a close friend he trusted implicitly, revealed a more intimate anxiety. Every night I ask myself if the road I have chosen will lead to liberation or simply destruction. I dream of a world freed from injustice, yet the faces of those I have seen fall along the way haunt me. Perhaps in my pursuit of the ideal, I have become blind to the cost of my actions. There was a subtle tension in his writing, a delicate balance between hope and despair. He believed in revolution with every fiber of his being, yet he understood the human toll it demanded. I could almost hear him pacing, pen scratching against paper, the scratch of ink echoing louder than any gunshot. It became clear that Che's doubts were not mere fleeting thoughts. They were profound, philosophical questions about morality, purpose, and destiny. In a particularly striking entry, he reflected, "Is a life spent in service to an ideal truly noble if it leaves the heart scarred? I have taken lives, guided men into peril, and yet I feel no closer to understanding the truth I chase. Perhaps courage is not in the taking of action, but in the acceptance of fear itself." There was a haunting beauty to his honesty. Che was willing to expose the very cracks that history often glosses over. He did not claim perfection. He claimed humanity. Each diary page was a mirror, showing the man behind the myth, flawed and fragile, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. At times, his writing became almost confessional, a private conversation with a self that no one else could read. One entry, written in haste during a rainstorm in the jungle, struck me particularly hard. The rain falls around me, relentless and cold. I am soaked to the bone, yet I do not shiver. It is not the cold I fear, but the knowledge that one day the world will judge me for the choices I make here. Will they see the heart or only the actions? And will that heart suffice to redeem the mistakes I have yet to commit? There was a sense of foreboding, a shadow hanging over his thoughts. Even amidst hope, Che's mind was a battlefield of fear and idealism, courage and self-doubt. He understood the stakes, not only the political, but the personal, the moral, and the existential. The more I read, the more I realized that Che's doubts were inseparable from his dreams. He wrote of visions of a free Cuba, of lands liberated from oppression, of equality and justice. Yet these dreams were tempered by constant questioning. I see a world that could be. I see it in flashes, moments of light piercing the darkness of oppression. And yet, each vision comes with a price. I feel the weight of each choice pressing on my chest, each life I touch like a pebble in a delicate balance. I wonder, sometimes, if the dream is worth the burden. This tension, the simultaneous hope and fear, was what made Che human. Here was a man capable of immense courage, yet vulnerable to the same doubts and insecurities that plague any person forced to shoulder impossible responsibility. I also noticed that Che often returned to themes of solitude. Even among comrades, he felt an isolation that was both painful and necessary. One entry described a night he spent alone by a campfire, listening to the distant sounds of the jungle. "I am surrounded by men who fight beside me, who trust me with their lives, yet I am utterly alone. The fire warms my body, but not my spirit." Perhaps this is the price of leadership, or perhaps it is the curse of those who dream too deeply. It struck me that Che's courage was inseparable from his loneliness. To follow one's ideals, he seemed to believe, required solitude, a willingness to stand apart from even those you love. And yet, the diaries also revealed a yearning for connection, a desire to be understood and to be forgiven for the fears he dared not voice aloud. As I closed the notebook, I felt the weight of his presence. Che Guevara was not simply a historical figure, a symbol on a poster or a slogan chanted by crowds. He was a man of flesh and bone, consumed by dreams, haunted by doubts, and unflinchingly honest with himself in ways the world would never see. This was the essence of his humanity. The revolutionary, the soldier, the legend, they were only masks. Beneath them was a man who feared failure, who questioned his choices, and who longed for a world that might never be realized. And in that vulnerability, I found an unexpected intimacy, a connection across time to a man who had once dared to chase the impossible. Amid the dust and shadows of the attic, the next notebook felt different. The previous volumes had drawn me into the fierce, restless mind of the revolutionary, weighed down by doubt and moral conflict. But this one, thin fraying, edges smudged with fingerprints, spoke of something softer, more intimate. The man capable of love, longing, and loss. Che Guevara, I realized, was not just a figure of action, but of emotion. The diary entries here were tender, almost confessional, revealing the bonds that tied him to people he could never fully stay with, and the ache of absence he carried like a shadow. One letter, addressed simply to Aleda, carried a quiet urgency. "I think of you often, though I fear these words cannot contain all that I feel. There is a violence in this world that pulls me away from you, and yet I long for your presence. I miss the simple things, your voice, your smile, the warmth of your hand. Even amidst battle, it is your face that keeps me human." It was in these lines that Che's vulnerability became almost tangible. The letters hinted at a side rarely seen in photographs or speeches, a man who feared that the revolutionary life might consume him entirely, leaving no room for love. Another entry, scrawled in a hurried hand, revealed his anxiety over what his absence cost those he cared about. "I left home to chase ideals, yet I wonder if those I love will remember the man beneath the uniform. My absence is their loss, and for that I carry a guilt heavier than any weapon. I wonder, in quiet moments, if my dreams justify the tears left in my wake." The tension between duty and desire haunted every page. Che's love was never simple. It was fractured by distance, danger, and the relentless march of revolution. And yet, it was this very love that tethered him to his humanity, grounding him when the world seemed intent on stripping him bare. There were also entries that revealed fleeting, tender interactions, moments of levity, affection, and shared laughter with comrades and loved ones. One diary snippet described a night by the campfire. "Tonight, we spoke of music and stories from home. I laughed more than I have in months. For a few hours, the war, the struggle, the ideals, they all faded. I felt like Ernesto again, not Che, not the soldier, but simply a man among men, laughing under the stars." It was a rare glimpse of normalcy, and reading it, I could almost see the firelight flickering on his face, hear the voices echoing in the night. Those moments were ephemeral, yet they carried immense emotional weight, reminders that even the fiercest of revolutionaries craved connection, warmth, and human understanding. The diaries did not shy away from loss either. One entry, written in a shaky hand, spoke of a comrade he had lost during a skirmish. He was young, full of hope. "I watched him fall, and though I fought to save him, I failed. How many more will I see die because of my choices? I write this not to mourn publicly, but so that someone someday might know the pain we bear silently, the grief we swallow alone. The raw honesty of the words left me breathless. Che was not immune to heartbreak. He carried it quietly, with stoic resolve, but each loss etched itself into his consciousness, shaping the man beneath the legend. Love, in these pages, was never purely romantic. It was familial, friendly, and communal, a recognition that human connection was both fragile and essential. In one tender note to a distant cousin, he wrote, "Family is a thread that stretches across continents and battles. Though I may be far, my heart is with you, tethered to memories of laughter and shared meals. Never doubt that, even in my absence, I am thinking of you." The juxtaposition was striking. A man capable of immense revolutionary fervor, yet equally capable of profound tenderness and loyalty. The diaries illustrated a duality that the world rarely acknowledged: the soldier and the lover, the leader and the son, the myth and the man. Even in his fleeting moments of joy, Che's writing carried an undercurrent of melancholy, a quiet recognition that love and loss were inseparable. A night under a tropical sky inspired this reflection. The stars are bright tonight, as though each one holds a memory, a voice, a laugh. I am both warmed and chilled by their light. I long for those I have left behind, and yet I know I cannot turn back. Love is a tether, yes, but also a reminder of all I risk losing in the path I have chosen. Reading these passages, I felt the weight of his humanity. Che's legendary courage, his ideals, his revolutionary zeal. These were inseparable from his capacity to feel deeply, to care, and to mourn. The diaries painted a portrait of a man whose heart was as full as his mind was sharp, whose inner life was as turbulent as the battles he fought. It became clear to me that this was the emotional core of the diaries, not the victories or the battles themselves, but the human connections that made those victories and losses meaningful. Che's private reflections reminded me that behind every historical figure, there exists a personal story of love, loss, and longing, often invisible to the public eye. As I closed the notebook, I lingered over a final entry, written during a brief respite from the revolution. I carry many names, many roles, but the one I cherish most is the one I hold in my heart. I am a friend, a lover, a brother, a son. Let history remember my actions, but let those who read this remember that even the fiercest of hearts beats with love and aches with loss. And with those words, Che's humanity was undeniable. Here was not just a revolutionary, but a man who loved fiercely, lost painfully, and cherished every fragile connection he could hold. The myth was powerful, but the man, revealed in these pages, was infinitely more compelling. The notebooks began to take on a darker tone. The early diaries had shown a man of doubt, introspection, and human longing. Now, the entries revealed the crushing weight of responsibility, the burden of leading men into danger, of making decisions that could determine life or death, of watching ideals clash with the raw brutality of reality. Che's words were deliberate, heavy with moral questioning. One entry, written during a campaign in the Cuban mountains, read, "I see the faces of the men I lead. They trust me implicitly, yet I am haunted by the knowledge that each order I give could end in blood. Victory seems a promise, but every step forward is paved with the suffering of those who follow. Is it worth it? I cannot turn back, yet I fear I may be sending them to destruction." The honesty was almost unbearable. Here was the legendary revolutionary, the man who inspired thousands with courage and conviction, confessing fear, not fear for himself, but fear for those who relied on him. The diary made it clear that leadership was never a shield from doubt. Rather, it was the crucible in which doubt was magnified. Another passage, scrawled in shaky ink during a night of restless contemplation, revealed a deeper moral struggle. Sometimes I wonder if ideals alone can justify the cost of their pursuit. We fight for justice, yet our hands are stained with the lives we take in its name. I ask myself if the world will understand that the path to freedom is paved with cruelty. And I ask myself if I can ever forgive my own heart. The tension between purpose and consequence was palpable. Che did not see violence as glamorous or heroic. He saw it as necessary, tragic, and morally complex. His diaries revealed the intimate, private torment of someone trying to reconcile action with conscience, ideology with human empathy. There were moments when he reflected on failures, both his own and those of the movement. In a terse, almost fragmented entry, he wrote, "Another village is lost. Another comrade falls. We advance, yet each victory feels hollow. I am exhausted by the weight of expectation, from men, from history, from myself. And I am afraid that the freedom we chase may never outweigh the suffering left behind." The psychological burden of being a revolutionary was not limited to battlefield decisions. Che was acutely aware of how history might judge him. One diary entry, penned in the quiet of dawn, expressed both fear and resignation. "I wonder how I will be remembered. The world loves its heroes, yet the truth is more complicated than slogans. Will they see the strategy, the sacrifice, the nights I wrestled with conscience? Or will they only remember the mask I wore for the world?" Even in these moments of self-reflection, Che's words carried a tension between duty and vulnerability. The diaries revealed him as a man striving to reconcile an unflinching dedication to ideals with a moral ambiguity inherent in their pursuit. Each decision, each action, was weighed against a silent ledger of ethical consequence, a ledger only he could see. Che also wrote about the loneliness imposed by responsibility. In one haunting entry, he described a night alone in a makeshift camp. "The men sleep, dreaming of home, of peace. I cannot join them. I am awake, a solitary figure in the dark, carrying the decisions of all. Each choice feels like a stone in my chest. I am grateful for their trust, but I am terrified of betraying it." It was not just fear for lives lost that haunted him. It was the isolation that leadership demanded. Even camaraderie could not bridge the gap between the private conscience and public duty. Che bore a weight that was entirely his own, and it left a deep imprint on every line of his writing. Yet, amid the despair, there were flashes of determination, the iron resolve that history remembers. One entry offered insight into his philosophy. "We are imperfect, men chasing imperfect dreams. Mistakes will be made. Lives will be lost. And yet we move forward, not because we are fearless, but because the cause is greater than ourselves. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is action despite it." Here, the diary merged reflection with resolve. Che was painfully aware of the cost, yet he did not abandon the cause. His writings revealed a revolutionary who understood both the gravity of his choices and the necessity of action, however morally ambiguous. There were also private admissions of doubt about the movement's direction, strategic errors, and the consequences of his own ambition. In a candid note, he wrote, "I sometimes ask if my vision blinds me to the suffering in my path. We fight for equality, yet inequality persists in the decisions I make. I am responsible for the consequences, and yet I fear that even my best intentions cannot undo the pain caused." Reading these passages, I felt the weight alongside him. The diaries did not romanticize revolution. They exposed its human cost and the emotional toll it exacted on those who carried the banner. Che's courage was inseparable from this awareness, and his leadership was inseparable from moral reflection. The last page in this section closed with a somber reflection, as if Che knew the struggle would never end, that doubt would always accompany action. The burden of revolution is eternal, as is the questioning of one's heart. I am a man of ideals, yet I am also a man of flesh, vulnerable and uncertain. And perhaps it is this tension, this awareness, that defines what it means to lead. It was a revelation. Che Guevara was not merely a symbol or a hero of history. He was a man grappling with the consequences of his convictions, balancing ambition with conscience, courage with fear. The diaries rendered his legend human, making his struggles all the more compelling, his victories all the more poignant, and his legacy all the more complex. By the time I reached the next notebook, it was clear that Che Guevara's diaries were no longer merely records of action and doubt. They had become a window into the secret workings of his mind. Here lay the contemplations, fears, and philosophical musings that he shared with no one. While the public knew of his revolutionary spirit, these pages revealed the restless intellect behind the legend, a man in constant dialogue with himself, wrestling with morality, mortality, and the very meaning of his life. One early entry struck me with its intensity. I have always believed that the world can be remade, that injustice is not immutable. Yet the closer I approach the truth, the more I see how deeply entrenched the darkness is. Can a single man, or even a movement, alter the course of history? Or are we destined to repeat the failures of those who came before? The words were almost confessional. Che was not certain, not even for a moment, that his efforts would bear fruit. His idealism was tempered by acute awareness of human fallibility, and a deep philosophical questioning permeated even his most practical strategies. In a letter to an unnamed confidant, Che explored the tension between action and thought. Sometimes I envy those who can act without reflection. I cannot. I am condemned to think, to question, to measure every step, every choice, against an invisible ledger of morality. And yet, to do nothing is a betrayal of the principles I have pledged to uphold. The diaries often shifted seamlessly between strategic considerations and personal introspection. Che's mind, I realized, was a labyrinth. One corridor led to plans for liberation, another to meditations on human nature, another to the fear of his own mortality. Each thought carried weight, each reflection a hidden burden. One particularly haunting entry revealed his awareness of the duality within himself. I am capable of tenderness and brutality in the same heartbeat. I can inspire men to sacrifice, and yet I can cause suffering in their name. Perhaps this is the paradox of revolution. To wield power responsibly, one must first confront the shadows within. It was in these shadows that Che seemed most honest, most vulnerable. He was aware that heroism is inseparable from the potential for cruelty, and the diaries became a quiet reckoning with the inner conflicts that no photograph or public speech could ever capture. Che's reflections often touched on mortality and the fleeting nature of life. In one entry, written in a remote hideout, he pondered, "Death is never distant. I feel its presence in every step, every bullet fired, every comrade lost. And yet, I do not fear it as much as I fear leaving behind only the mask of myself, rather than the truth of what I am. To be remembered is not enough. To be understood, that is the true challenge." The suspense in these pages was not born of danger alone, but of existential uncertainty. Here was a man constantly questioning the significance of his choices, the authenticity of his actions, and the legacy he would leave behind. Che also wrestled with questions of human nature and justice. Is humanity capable of genuine equality, or is it always corrupted by greed and fear? I fight for freedom, yet I am haunted by the knowledge that oppression can be as insidious as any weapon. Perhaps the greatest struggle is not against tyrants, but against the darkness within ourselves. These were not idle musings. They were the private struggles of a man tasked with reshaping the world. Each reflection revealed his acute awareness that the ideals of revolution could never be separated from the imperfections of those who pursued them. Yet even amidst this philosophical weight, there were glimpses of hope, of a mind that believed in the possibility of change. There are moments brief and luminous, when I see the world as it could be, a world where justice is not a word, but a reality, where men are guided by conscience and compassion rather than fear. I hold on to these visions, fragile as they are, because they are the only stars in a sky so often darkened by cruelty. The diaries also hinted at secrets Che could not voice publicly, private fears, unspoken regrets, and doubts about whether his methods were justified. He often returned to the question of whether the end could ever truly justify the means. Every action, however noble in intent, bears consequences. I am aware of the lives shaped or ended by my choices. History may forgive, but conscience never forgets. And so I write these words not for the world, but for myself, in the hope that understanding may temper the weight I carry. It was here, in these private reflections, that Che's humanity shone most brightly. He was not a myth or a symbol, but a man burdened with insight, conscience, and empathy. His intellect and idealism were inseparable from his self-doubt, his courage inseparable from his fear. I closed the notebook slowly, feeling the presence of a mind both brilliant and restless. Che Guevara had fought battles in jungles and cities, but the most profound conflicts, the moral, philosophical, and existential ones, were waged within. The diaries offered no solutions, no simple answers, only the raw, unfiltered truth of a man grappling with ideals, conscience, and mortality. And in that truth lay the power of these pages. They reminded me that history's heroes are never simple, and that understanding a legend requires venturing into the hidden, secretive corridors of their mind. As I opened the next diary, a cold draft seemed to seep from its pages. The handwriting was tighter now, more hurried, as if the author had felt the weight of time pressing relentlessly against him. In the entries here, Che Guevara confronted the inevitable. Death, not just as a distant abstraction, but as an ever-present companion, shadowing every step, every decision, every heartbeat. One entry, written during a tense campaign in the Bolivian highlands, immediately drew me in. I sense it everywhere, the presence of death, patient and unyielding. It does not announce itself with drums or banners, but in the silence of the night, in the trembling of leaves, in the glance of a man who watches too closely. I cannot ignore it. I feel it in my bones. The language was chillingly intimate. Che did not speak of fear for himself alone, but for those around him, and the inevitability of loss. Even the strongest revolutionary could not escape the haunting premonition of mortality. In a letter to a confidant, he wrote with a stark honesty rarely seen in public documents. Each morning, I rise knowing that the day may be my last. Each step I take is measured against the possibility that history will claim me prematurely. And yet, I cannot retreat. To live without acting would be a greater death than any bullet could bring. There was an unsettling tension in these words, a mixture of courage and vulnerability. Che had embraced danger for the sake of ideals, yet he remained acutely aware of the fragility of life. The diaries were not merely records, they were private rehearsals with mortality itself. A particularly haunting entry described a night alone in the mountains, listening to the jungle's strange symphony. The wind carries whispers tonight. I feel watched by eyes I cannot see, hunted by a fate I cannot outrun. And still I write, as if these words could stave off the inevitable, as if confessing my thoughts might keep death at bay. I know it will come, but I wish to meet it not as a stranger, but as the man I have tried to be. It was here that suspense took hold, not from immediate danger, but from the quiet, patient certainty that Che's life would be claimed one day. The diary seemed to foreshadow what history would confirm, that his path, no matter how noble in intent, was a perilous one. Che also reflected on the idea of legacy in these entries, aware that death was intertwined with memory. I wonder who will remember me when I am gone. Will they recall the ideals or only the violence? Will they understand the burden, the sacrifices, the nights I trembled beneath the stars? I hope someone sees beyond the myth, to the man who dreamed and faltered in equal measure. Even in these contemplations, there was a tension between hope and despair. Che's awareness of mortality did not lead him to resignation. It sharpened his resolve. Each diary entry was a negotiation with fate, a record of courage defined not by fearlessness, but by the refusal to be paralyzed by fear. One entry struck me particularly deeply, written during a moment of isolation. I am surrounded by danger, yet it is the quiet moments that frighten me most. The night brings no action, no clarity, only the awareness of what may come. I imagine my end with terrible clarity, and still I cling to life, not for myself, but for the cause, for the men who trust me, for the dream that refuses to die. The diaries revealed a man living in constant awareness of mortality, yet refusing to let that awareness dominate him. His fear was present, but it did not define him. His choices, his ideals, and his compassion did. Che even recorded premonitions of betrayal, reflecting the ever-present tension between trust and danger. I feel it, the shadow of betrayal. Men may falter, allegiances may shift. I cannot know who will stand beside me when the storm comes, who will remain when the world narrows to survival. And yet I continue, because retreat is not an option, because the dream demands persistence, even in the face of unseen threats. The combination of existential dread and human intuition lent these entries a sense of suspense more potent than any battlefield encounter. Che's awareness of mortality was not passive. It was active, a mental and emotional battlefield that shaped his every choice. In the closing pages of this notebook, Che reflected on courage and the inevitability of death. Perhaps the measure of a man is not in how long he lives, nor in how many battles he wins, but in how fully he confronts the truth of his mortality. To act despite fear, to love despite loss, to dream despite the certainty of the end. This is the legacy I choose to pursue. Reading this, I felt a profound reverence. Here was a man who faced the ultimate human truth with unflinching honesty, balancing courage and reflection in equal measure. The diaries had transformed from personal records into a meditation on life itself, revealing the strength and fragility of Che Guevara in ways history seldom captured. As I closed the notebook, the attic felt heavier somehow, filled with the silent echoes of a life lived at the edge of mortality. Che's shadow lingered, not as a legend on posters, but as a man grappling with his inevitable fate, fearful, reflective, and resolutely alive in every word he wrote. The final notebook in the chest was thinner than the others, its pages fragile and yellowed. As I carefully turned them, I sensed a shift in tone. The urgency, the doubts, the shadows of mortality all remained, but there was a new undercurrent, reflection, acceptance, and a quiet reckoning with the life he had led. Che Guevara, the revolutionary, the soldier, the symbol, was now revealing the part of himself that wrestled with legacy. The first entry was striking in its honesty. I have lived many lives in one. The boy from Rosario, the doctor, the traveler, the soldier, the revolutionary. Each version of myself has left its mark, some visible, some invisible. And now I wonder what remains of the man beneath the layers, the one who dreamed quietly and feared openly. Even in these contemplations, there was humility. Che did not write of grandeur or glory. He wrote of the complexity of his own existence, acknowledging both the triumphs and the failures, the love and the loss, the courage and the fear. One passage reflected on the men who had followed him, the lives he had influenced, and the inevitable judgment of history. They will speak of victories and defeats, of battles won and lost. But what of the quiet sacrifices, the nights spent questioning, the tears swallowed in solitude? I fear history will remember only the mask I wore, not the heart that beat beneath it. And yet, I hope someone will see the truth in the spaces between the stories, the humanity in the man. It was clear that Che's concern for legacy extended beyond public perception. He cared deeply about understanding, empathy, and the moral truth of his actions. His diaries in this light were both confession and testament, an attempt to ensure that the man, not just the legend, endured. In another entry, Che reflected on his ideals and the ultimate meaning of his struggle. Revolution is not merely about the overthrow of regimes or the conquest of territories. It is about the transformation of hearts, the awakening of conscience, the pursuit of justice in a world often blind to it. I may fall as all men do, but if even a spark of understanding survives, then the effort has been worth the cost. The combination of idealism and realism in his words was remarkable. Che did not claim certainty about the future, nor did he shy away from acknowledging the imperfections of his methods. Yet he remained steadfast in his belief that meaningful change required courage, sacrifice, and unflinching honesty. There were also intimate reflections on mortality and the fleeting nature of life, written with a poetic sensibility that contrasted sharply with the earlier urgency of battle. I imagine myself gone, remembered perhaps only as a face on a wall, a slogan, a fleeting symbol. And yet, I hope that somewhere someone will see beyond that, to the man who loved, who doubted, who hoped. Perhaps that is the truest form of immortality, not to be idolized, but to be understood. The diaries revealed that Che's greatest fear was not death itself, but misinterpretation, the erasure of his humanity beneath layers of myth. He longed for recognition of the struggles that could never be publicly displayed, the sleepless nights, the moral compromises, the private grief. One of the most compelling entries addressed the tension between history and memory. History is written in grand strokes, in victories and defeats, in speeches and battles. Memory is intimate, fragile, and incomplete. I hope that in my absence, memory preserves not only the actions, but the intentions, the heart behind the deeds. To be remembered as a man, flawed and striving, is the legacy I desire most. There was a quiet wisdom in these words, a sense that Che had come to terms with the impermanence of life while striving to make it meaningful. The diaries, in their raw honesty, served as a bridge between the man he had been and the legend the world knew. In a final, almost meditative entry, Che reflected on the dualities that had defined his life, love and loss, courage and fear, action and doubt. I am many things, and yet none entirely. I am both hero and failure, beloved and condemned, alive in memory and destined to fade. Perhaps the measure of a life is not in how it is remembered, but in the depth of engagement, in the courage to feel, to act, to question, to love. If this is true, then my life has not been in vain. As I set the notebook down, I felt an overwhelming sense of reverence. Che Guevara had faced death, doubt, love, and loss with a clarity and honesty that few could match. His legacy was not simply the history of a revolutionary. It was the intimate truth of a man who dared to confront the world and himself with uncompromising integrity. The chest of diaries, now fully explored, offered more than historical insight. It offered connection. Across decades and continents, I had witnessed the private thoughts of a man who had inspired millions, yet had remained profoundly human in his struggles. Che's life was a tapestry of courage, reflection, vulnerability, and conviction. And in these pages, the legend and the man finally coexisted. He would be remembered for many things, his ideals, his battles, his image. But for those who read these letters, he would also be remembered as Ernesto, a man who doubted, who loved, who feared, and who strove to leave the world a little better than he had found it. And perhaps, in the end, that was the truest legacy any of us could hope to leave. The chest of diaries was finally empty, its pages having revealed the intimate, unvarnished truth of a life that history had only partially captured. I sat back, letting the weight of what I had read settle around me. Across decades and continents, I had glimpsed the private world of Ernesto Che Guevara, the man behind the myth, the human behind the legend. It was strange to think that the same figure immortalized in photographs, posters, and slogans had lain awake in small, dim rooms, grappling with doubt, fear, and longing. He had loved, grieved, questioned, and hoped, yet most of the world would never know these moments. And yet, in these diaries, I felt closer to him than any statue or biography could have allowed. The notebooks had revealed a man of contrasts, courageous yet fearful, idealistic yet painfully aware of the world's imperfections, steadfast in his convictions, yet tender in private. Every entry, every letter, every scribbled thought was a testament to the complexity of human experience, the fragile tension between hope and despair, action and reflection, life and the ever-present shadow of death. I realized then that history often simplifies its heroes, compressing their lives into symbols, slogans, and stories of triumph. But these diaries reminded me that the true measure of a person is not in their public victories, but in the private struggles that remain unseen. Che's courage had always been inseparable from his humanity, his convictions inseparable from his doubts. To read his words was to witness the full spectrum of a life lived intensely, courageously, and authentically. Closing the chest, I felt an echo of his presence linger in the room, as if the words themselves had imbued the space with a quiet vitality. The revolutionary was gone, yet the man endured, alive in his thoughts, his fears, and the small, tender moments he had entrusted to paper. I thought of the countless people who would never read these diaries, who would only know Che as an icon. And yet, for those who did, who ventured into the hidden corridors of his mind, he was no longer simply a symbol. He was Ernesto, a man who dreamed, doubted, loved, and lived fully, even knowing the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. As I left the attic, the sunlight fell softly across the chest, illuminating its worn surface and faded edges. History would continue to remember the legend, as it should. But the diaries had given me something else entirely. A bridge across time, a chance to understand the human truth behind the revolutionary, and a reminder that even the mightiest figures are bound by the same fears, hopes, and longings that define us all. And in that quiet understanding, I felt both awe and solace. Che Guevara's life had ended, but his words, his thoughts, and his humanity remained, echoing across the past, into the present, and perhaps into the hearts of those willing to listen.